Hey everybody, welcome in once again to Strictly Speaking. Today we're going deep inside America's intelligence agencies, kind of, sort of, such as they are. Are the intelligence agencies we have relied upon, the FBI, CIA, still working for the benefit of the American people, or maybe against it? We're going to talk to an expert in the field, Dr. J. Michael Waller, a scholar practitioner in strategic communication and unconventional conflict. That's a mouthful, and that's also an understatement because that's what we're in right now. He's a former CIA operative, senior analyst for strategy at the Center for Security Policy, as well as the president of Georgetown Research, which is a political risk and private intelligence company. He was founding editorial board member of NATO's peer-reviewed Defense Strategic Communications Journal from 2015 through 2018, worked for the CIA in Central America, did some groundbreaking scholarship after the Soviet Empire's breakup, which is fascinating in and of its own right, and taught history and methods at America's premier intelligence schools. He's got a PhD in international security affairs from Boston University. He received his military training as an insurgent with the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, the Contras. For 13 years, he was the Walter and Leonore Annenberg Professor of International Communication at the Institute of World Politics, let me catch my breath, that's a mouthful too, in Washington, D.C., where he designed and taught the world's only graduate program on public diplomacy and political warfare. He's the author and editor of books relating to intelligence, political warfare, public diplomacy, terrorism, and subversion, including one that I'm going to ask about. It's important. The prize-winning Secret Empire, the KGB in Russia Today, which predicted way back in 1994 of the rise of a Russian gangster state dominated by the old KGB, like people like Vladimir Putin. His latest book is Big Intel, how the CIA and FBI went from Cold War heroes to deep state villains. Let's welcome Dr. J. Michael Waller to our program here on Strictly Speaking. Dr. Waller, good to have you. How are you, sir?
Great. It's good to be here.
That's a heck of an introduction and very well earned. That's a career and a half. My goodness gracious. I am so fascinated by people in the intelligence world. Anytime I get a chance to pick the brain of somebody who has worked in CIA or in the FBI or in counterintelligence or any of the agencies, I'm all ears. Can we start there? I want to give people a little bit of a primer, kind of a backgrounder on how you got involved in that. What kid grows up and says, "I think I want to be a spy," or "I want to work for a spy agency someday"? How'd you get started?
Well, the trick was being in high school, being an idealistic, nature-loving kid who grew up in the countryside and was worried that there was a nuclear power plant being built in our state, and then got caught up in, as a do-gooder, got caught up in the propaganda of malicious people who recruited me and trained me to break into a nuclear power plant construction site and vandalize the containment dome, uh, and then um, and then tear me down in what I later learned was a Maoist struggle session, and told me that this isn't about the environment at all. It's about overthrowing American capitalism.
Did you just say you got started out by being an idealist, an environmentalist, and you were talked into breaking into a nuclear facility and vandalizing part of the nuclear or core or whatever? Is that what you had to do?
Well, no, the plant was still under construction. So we were trained to go take canoes up a salt marsh with bolt cutters and spray paint, cut through the chain link fence, and then spray paint slogans on the nuclear containment dome.
So kind of like throwing oil and soup and tomato soup at paintings of the Michelangelo and things to stop oil now. So you were an environmentalist when you got started, and that's how you got brought in. Continue.
Well, then I realized I was a dupe and thought, I'm going to fight you guys. If it takes the rest of my life, I'm going to expose you. So that's how I got involved in this movement then in college as an undergraduate. And
So
it's
why do
not
you
that
think they
many.
told you? Why do you think they told you so early on that this was about bringing down American capitalism? I mean, they had you working with them. They had you on their side. Why did they expose you so quickly to that, to the point where you would say, "Whoa, that's not what I'm signing up for here"? And like you said, committing yourself to pushing back and fighting that.
They thought they could recruit me as a leader. And they finally said in a struggle session. So this is this Maoist type of session. I didn't know what Mao was at the time. This was in the 70s.
Mhm.
I was just a kid. Just a faraway idea or person. And but I didn't know until much later that this is what they do to try to break you down, to try to separate you from your beliefs, separate you from your conscience, separate you from right and wrong, and to reshape you as a person, as a permanent member of their cadre. So they thought they could finally break me and say, "Come on, kid, wise up. This is what the fight's all about." But they made a mistake in telling me about it.
Tell us what is involved in a struggle session.
So they sit and they isolate you by yourself, and obviously in a room, and then they come in, and it's kind of a good cop bad cop, three of them and one of you, and they get you to admit your flaws, and the flaws of society, and the reason to fight against it, and you're all by yourself, and then they'll push you and they'll challenge you to say and to try to believe in things that you don't really believe in or mean, but you're kind of there. You want to please them. On the other hand, you still have your conscience left, and you're not going to go along with everything. But I went along anyway to see where it would go because I was curious, and I really wanted to become a leader in this type of anti-nuclear activity. And that's when they said, one of them said, why? Actually, one of them said, "Why are you in the movement?" And I said, "Because I'm concerned about boiling water from the reactor cooler system being dumped out in the ocean, because that's where I go fishing with my dad and my grandpa." And then the other one just looked at me and said, "No, no, this is about overthrowing American capitalism."
So I'm fascinated by this whole origin story here. Who are they? Are these Soviets who had come to the United States to recruit? Or are these American communists? Who are they that said, "Hey, we want you in. We want you to be a part of this. We want you to be a leader. We want you to be one of us"? How did you hook up with them? I mean, how does a high school kid say, "I really want to do something to help the environment. I want to stop the fishing hole from being polluted by the nuclear plant over there"? How do you hook up with these people that have these plans?
This was a New England anti-nuclear coalition called the Clamshell Alliance, and it was mostly just
Mhm.
environmentalists and pretty laid back, really nice people. They all meant well. Oh, no, not all. Most of them meant well, but a lot of them at the time. So this was mid late 70s, around 1977, 78. Uh,
Mhm.
a lot of them had been anti-war protesters during Vietnam, and among the anti-war protesters, there were pro-Hanoi, pro-Viet Cong, pro-enemy protesters. These were the
Communist
organizers.
sympathizer.
Yes, or even communist agents for all I know. I didn't understand who they were at the time, but I was recruited by my high school social studies teacher.
Was your social studies teacher an actual communist sympathizer himself?
It appeared that way, and looking back, I just liked the guy. I thought he was cool. He was interesting. He liked to break rules, and like, oh, this is kind of neat. You don't get that, in high school. That's kind of fun. And so I was really, intrigued by all of it. And he was just a fun person. So so that's how we were brought in.
Where were mom and dad during all this? Any conversation with mom and dad? I'm really concerned about something. What can I do? Kind of thing. Or were you doing all this outside of the eye and earshot of mom and dad?
My dad was an engineer with General Electric, which is a company that built nuclear reactors. Now, he was in the different division, but he's being an engineer, he says, "No, these things are safe." And he tried to explain it to me in an engineering way, as if that would persuade somebody who's more artistic than engineering. And my mom is just like, "Well, kids are going to do what they're going to do as long as you don't get stupid." Uh, but I was going to do something stupid. I just wasn't going to tell them.
So okay, so you have this experience that you go through this struggle session. They eventually tell you what they're up to, and you're just like, "Nope, I'm going to dedicate myself to fighting that." Now, for some men, young men, like in your case, that means I'm going to go enlist. I'm going to be a Marine. I'm going to fight communists. I'm going to fight these people who are doing these things. But you didn't do that. You took a different path. Where did you go once you decided I'm going to fight them? What does that next step look like?
So in the fall of 1980, I was a freshman at college at George Washington University, and this was Jimmy Carter's last months of his term. I cast my absentee vote for Ronald Reagan, and of course, back in those days, you had to go to your town clerk to with your ID, or they had to at least know you personally because it was a small town, and to register to vote. So it's all in writing with signatures and everything. And then I got my absentee ballot and cast it for Reagan, and my dorm was only 3 blocks from the White House. And at the same time, I got involved as an intern for my senator, because being from a small state, it's easy to get a Senate internship because they like people from their own states. And he was a solid conservative, and so Reagan was in, and it was all very exciting. So imagine I had gone from environmentalist to Reagan voter within a short period of years. I was never a left winger. I just liked the environment. I just liked fishing and nature, and so I hadn't been brought in into an ideological movement, so it was not a problem to be a kid voting for Reagan and then working for a conservative senator. So through that, through the internships on Capitol Hill, you get to network with everybody and meet everybody. Then I got involved with the College Republican National Committee and Young Americans for Freedom and became the coordinator for youth efforts to support what Ronald Reagan wanted to do to push back and destroy the Soviet Union. I thought, this is for me. This is what I want to do. And so that's how I got started.
And they had you. Boy, that's a phenomenal story. And so you get into, and I was reading and listening to some of the other conversations you've been involved in, and you talk about wanting to be a journalist. And that's how you ended up being sent to, well, a number of different countries. And can you give us that next step in your progression from being an interested college student to being all in to joining the college Republicans, whatever Reagan can, we can do to help him and destroy communism and the Soviets and so forth. How did you end up in journalism, and where did that take you?
That was another high school thing. I was editor of my high school paper. It wasn't
Well, that was
much. It
before
was,
you got to college. Okay, I got it
yeah,
out of order. That was before you got to
yeah,
college. Okay, but
yeah.
tell us that part.
And so it's just a lame thing to do. I mean, it was fun to do, but it wasn't real journalism. It was some people covering sports events, and then I was mostly editorializing about stuff I had no idea about. But it was fun. But I wanted to get into real journalism and to be, to have adventures at the same time. So I set up a student journalism project in a newspaper at George Washington University. And this was a movement at the time where this was happening around college campuses. So Dartmouth Review, with Dinesh D'Souza, he founded that paper at the same time. And so there was a whole network of us. We didn't know each other, but then there were donors who supported. They didn't support my paper because it was too rough edged, but they supported the more sophisticated ones. But we all got together to know each other, and I started inviting them down to Central America. But before the Central American connection, I had met a journalist from Soldier of Fortune magazine who came to speak at our school. And he had just returned from Afghanistan with Ahmad Shah Massoud's Northern Alliance forces who were fighting the Soviet troops. And so when I talked to him, he said, well, come on to Afghanistan with me. That'd be fun. So what an exciting thing to do. Well, at the same time, I was by now the unofficial. So I wasn't working for the White House. I was working at College Republicans, but I was a youth coordinator to promote Reagan's anti-Soviet strategy and popularize the idea on the college campuses. And I met people at the White House through this networking. And so one of them said to me when I told her that I had this chance to go to Afghanistan, she said, "Yeah, but come on, you speak Spanish. You can do better than that. How about if you went to Central America?" I said, "Okay, how do I do it?" She goes, "Oh, I can connect you with people." So I was not sent down there. I went on my own, but then I had help along the way. And it wasn't until a long time later that I realized what kind of help that was.
Okay, now we're into some really fascinating stuff here because, first of all, we'll talk about Central America and we'll talk about Nicaragua and everything else. But the idea of Afghanistan, going to Afghanistan as a young man in your 20s, and weren't the Soviets recently had just invaded Afghanistan? Isn't that a pretty dangerous place to be?
Yeah, very.
And what would your role have been? I know you chose to go to Central America. What would the role have been to go to Afghanistan at that point in time?
Purely as a student journalist and nothing more. So it was the White House folks who said, "Go on down to Central America. We can or have it arranged for you. Here's somebody to talk to." And it was a man named Constantine Menges who was on the White House National Security Council, but he was also a senior CIA officer called a National Intelligence Officer for the Western Hemisphere. So he was overseeing a lot of the things going on in the Western Hemisphere, and he reported not only to President Reagan, but to CIA Director Bill Casey. And he said, "Yeah, I can set you up. Let's chat. Why don't you meet some friends of mine?"
So you were going down there basically as a journalist. That's the reason you went down.
Yeah, at my own initiative. But I got my feet wet and walking around money from a really nice old guy who'd served in the OSS fighting Nazis and who my friend in the White House had told me to meet. Well, I didn't really know who he was, and we just hung out and talked a few times. And then he said, "Hey, you're going down to Central America. Here's some walking around money." And that was so I didn't know what I was getting into, but I thought, okay, I can always use the walking around money, and and it was as a result of that first trip and getting my feet wet that I was told by my White House friend, look, the CIA is not doing its job to get intelligence on a lot of Soviet support for communist insurgencies in El Salvador and Guatemala and elsewhere. We need it. So when you go down there, can you look for this and bring it back? So that's what I went and did for the CIA for a number of years.
Tell me more about that walking around money too, because I know you've talked about that too, and you've written about that too. This money wasn't coming from the government. This was coming directly from the director of the CIA, right?
I didn't know that. Yes, it was $1,000, so it wasn't much, but it was for a 21-year-old college kid back then. It was a lot, but it would fund a few trips down to Central America and back. And
But
so
you had obviously made an impression on some pretty high-ranking people for to even be on the radar of the director of the CIA saying, "I want this young kid working with us and for us," and giving you a little bit of the means to go and do some of those things. That's an astounding accomplishment. I mean, did you know, well, you said you didn't know. When did you find out that you were that highly thought of to the point where the CIA director knew who you were, much less was funding, some of your activities?
well, it's one of these things where you don't realize it until later. It's just something neat that happens, but you don't put it all together because things are moving so fast and it's an exciting time. And how can somebody so small and so insignificant really matter that much to somebody running the CIA? But at one point, this old OSS guy named Jim had said, it was about a week before I was about to go out down with the Contras for the first time.
Mhm.
He said, go to the 5 o'clock vigil mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral on Saturday, sit in the back left pews, and don't leave till somebody talks to you. And I thought, because he knew I was Catholic, I thought, okay, maybe this is just a way to get me to church. So, I'm living a college life, right? So I'm maybe I should really go to church and sort of try to make things right before going on this trip to Central America, where you're walking right into a war, as a volunteer
Yeah.
by yourself and with one other friend who I brought along. He didn't know any of this. So I was at church, and sure enough, I saw CIA Director Casey there. He had also been in the OSS fighting the Nazis, and so he was back now to rejuvenate a really demoralized CIA. And I thought, well, that's a coincidence because it's Washington D.C. and you see famous people, wherever you go. So when leaving, but I remember being told, don't leave the pew until somebody talks to you. So Director Casey went to leave at the end of Mass, and I sort of just shot out my hand like some goofy, intern saying, "Hey, nice to see you, Mr. Casey," type of thing. And typical stuff. But then somebody stopped me at the pew, said, "You're Waller?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Stay here." So she waved. Casey walked up to me, and he mumbled something at me. I didn't understand what he said, so I asked him to repeat it. He mumbled it again, and then the man behind him said two words that I needed to remember and barked it at me like a drill sergeant would, and then left. So that was the only time I ever saw Bill Casey. But I thought, what did that mean? So I took it as some kind of a person to talk to. His Capitan Luque was the name. That's Spanish. It would be Captain Luque or Captain Luke. And so I went down to Honduras with my friend, and we didn't have because Honduras had then and still has now pretty good border patrols and airport security for a small country. And they wouldn't let us in until we said where we were staying. So I just winged it and said, we're staying at the Holiday Inn. And they still wouldn't let us in because I could have been one of these, what they called sandinistas, these sort of sandal wearing hippies helping out the Sandinista communists in Nicaragua, which was bordering Honduras. And the Hondurans wanted to keep them out. So I just thought I'd pull rank and I would ask for Capitan Luque. And they looked, and then somebody finally came out, and then he said something, and then he escorted us through. So I thought he was Captain Luque, and it wasn't for 30 years that I realized that I was Capitan Luque, and that CIA Director Casey had given me my cryptonym in church. And the reason he did it at church, because he went to daily mass, he would meet different people at different churches all the time and say things to them or pass things to them because he could never be forced to testify before Congress what went on in church.
So they gave you a pseudonym in church so that it would be kept private,
Yeah.
and nobody could force them to talk about it, but didn't tell you that was your pseudonym. That could have gone so badly. Had you
Oh, of
gone
course it could have.
to Honduras and said, "No, I'm looking for Capitan, what is Luque? I'm looking for Capitan Luque," but you happen to phrase it where you just said the two words, and so they identified you as Capitan Luque, and you didn't know it.
I am guessing that the Hondurans had been given a list by the U.S. to say anybody who comes through with these names, just let them through. They're helping us. They're
Okay.
helping us and helping Honduras. I never knew the real reason, but I learned from Bill Casey's son-in-law 30 years later, who was close friends with him and had worked with him. He had done similar things with Casey, and he knew Casey had done it with others to help the solidarity movement in Poland and to get equipment in and people in and money in to the anti-communist resistance movements in Eastern Europe at exactly the same time. So he's the one who said, no, wasn't giving you a name of somebody down there. That was your cryptonym. You were Captain Luque. So then it all
Yeah.
came together, but it took 30 years. And this was not in the
It's
CIA
amazing.
book.
It's an incredible story.
Yeah.
And you know, I guess this is one of the things, and I probably sound like a fanboy right now because I'm just fascinated by this whole the way the intelligence apparatus works and how they can tell somebody like you who barely knows you're on the inside now. They're giving you code names, pseudonyms, cryptonyms, as you say, but not telling you about it and not having any idea how this thing could go. I mean, I've been told that there are CIA agents who go their entire careers who never meet the director. The director doesn't come down and mill about with with every single agent here. You're a 21-year-old kid. You're not in the agency, but you're helping support or being willing to report back as a journalist from Central America, and suddenly you're on the radar of the director of the CIA, and they're giving you cryptonyms for crying out loud. I mean, when you think back to that, I mean, does that still go on, or were you a unicorn? Were you a very unique person in that regard?
I understand there were others, but I never knew who any of them were. But this was Bill Casey doing it. So he was a wealthy man who had been in the OSS when they did the seat of the pants stuff, anything it takes to defeat the Nazis. And he liked to have, like what Wild Bill Donovan, who founded the OSS, was recruiting what he called his amateurs. And these were sharp guys who either didn't know what they were doing or didn't care, but they just wanted to, they had something to them that would make them good operatives. And so he built the OSS out of these amateurs. So none of them were intelligence professionals because the U.S. didn't have an intelligence service. So this is what Bill Casey was doing as part of it, but he was paying for it out of his pocket, and he was doing it outside official CIA channels because he didn't trust those in the CIA either because they were so political that they didn't share Reagan's agenda to get rid of the communists, or they were dragging their feet on it, or they would leak something to the Washington Post, or they would leak something to Congress. So Casey had this whole parallel effort on the side.
Well, what a coincidence. Here we are 50 years later, and I don't trust the CIA now. Uh, but which is kind of part of the reason for your book, and we'll get into that in a moment. Um, Tell me about any of the dangerous situations you walked into. As you mentioned, you're going down and walking into the middle of a war. Did you ever find yourself in a position where there were bombings nearby, there were shellings, there were firefights, those kinds of things, or were you always at arm's length from the actual, real dangerous
No, we
stuff?
got in the middle of it.
Can
My
you talk
roommate
about
was killed.
anything specific?
Oh, we got,
Your roommate
the
was killed.
Katusha rocket. Yeah, my roommate, Pete Bertie, he was killed down there.
Oh wow.
He
So
got hit with
so how do you
a
handle that as a how how do you handle that, like, as a civilian? I mean, I would imagine your roommate gets killed. You're in the middle of some of these, very dangerous situations, be it firefights or what have you. You wanted to stay, and once again, did you ever, like, think to yourself, "Maybe I can fight this fight against them in a different way than being right here 5 minutes or 5, yards away from a kill zone?"
Well, I wasn't with him when that happened, but I was. So I would go in for a week or two at a time, and it lasted over a period of 7 years. And and so I was really close. But by that time, I was not answering to anybody. I was just doing it on my own because I believed in the fight, and I'd become friends with the Contra commanders, and I just felt closely identified to their cause. But it's like if you're a, I don't know, if you're a professional soldier or a police officer or somebody else, or fireman. You're just putting yourself into danger just because that's what you do. And yeah, there's kind of a rush that comes with it, and yeah, you realize it's very risky, but
Yep.
we all have certain risks, and if you believe in something, then you believe in it.
The reason I'm so impressed by all of this, Michael, is a police officer, a firefighter, a soldier. They're trained though on how to deal with those risks. They're trained on how to minimize those risks, how to protect themselves, and so forth. You're a civilian. You're just a guy down there on your own, and you're putting yourself in harm's way. I mean, did you ask for? I mean, did you carry a sidearm? Did you ask anybody for things that you should do in order to make sure that if you get yourself into a scrape or find yourself in a situation, how to save your life?
I was given no point of contact to turn to who was American, and I was told to stay away from the American embassy. That would have caused a political scandal, but it would have let the CIA operatives know that there was this private network that they didn't know about also down there. So I kept completely away from them. So if something
Wow.
had happened to me, the Contras would have taken care of me, and they had points of contact for me, so they could have gotten me to safety or reach my family. But I
Okay.
had no
All right.
training
Well,
at
that's
all. I
the
was in ROTC for a little bit. I had just signed up for ROTC at Georgetown, and I hadn't gone through basic training. I hadn't signed anything yet. But then I thought, this is just run by depressed colonels from Vietnam who have, the Army's not doing anything. So I thought, let's get involved another way. And so I got my military training as a guerrilla in guerrilla warfare using all Soviet equipment and other non-U.S. equipment. And so that was how it came in. So it took me a long
that's
time before I ever fired an American weapon.
that is an incredible story. At what point did you think to yourself, and you said 7 years, so you were there from what, 21 to around 28 years old or so?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. At what point, or did there come a point where you're looking at yourself, particularly in a dangerous situation, and you think to yourself, what the hell am I doing here? All I did was not want the fishing hole that me and Dad used to use to get poisoned by the nuclear thing. Fast forward from 15 to 28, and when I'm sitting here in Nicaragua right now, or Honduras, or wherever it is that you were at that particular point in Central America, in the middle of a firefight. Did you ever stop and think, what the hell happened to me?
Oh yeah, many a times, lots. Yeah, but then you want to do it again. You jump out of a plane for the first time, and it's scary, and you're free falling, and you're never going to do this again. And then as soon as you're done, you want to do it again.
Well,
But you did
that's an
have a
attitude
better.
not a lot. Yeah, yeah. No, that's an attitude not a lot of people have, particularly again if people are dying around you or people that you know as well. But because I'm pretty sure if you did that skydive thing and your best friend skydove and crashed and didn't make it, you weren't going to go again, are you?
A lot of people do, but I would only go down for a
Depends on
week or
how
two at a
much you seek
time.
that thrill, right?
What's that? I missed what you said.
Oh no, I just said it depends on how much of a thrill seeker you are, how much you're really seeking out that rush, I suppose, if you do something like that. Because again, you're doing it though, not just for the thrill seeking of it and not just the rush. You described rush a moment ago, but you believe in something here, and something struck you very early on in your life. And obviously, President Reagan, appealed to you so much so that you said, "We are going to fight back against this Soviet empire." This is did you recognize it as what it would come to be known as a Cold War? You're participating in some way, in the way that you can, in trying to defeat a common enemy of the Contras down there, that you were trying to actually win a quote unquote Cold War, even though it was hot in the various places you were.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I was very aware of that part, but it still doesn't strike you until you're much older. So for me, it was just normal. I never told these stories to people. I mean, my friends knew I was down there. I had written about it as a journalist, and I was never told by anybody in the CIA, what to write about. That was not part of that was not what I was doing. But you, I had not ever told anybody until writing the book that I had actually worked for Bill Casey, the CIA director at that time, because I didn't think it would be
So
interesting.
How is it anything but? It's fascinating, and I can't believe you didn't tell anybody about all of this. This is incredible. Before we talk about big intel and we come current with the current state of the CIA and the FBI and even the IRS in terms of weaponization of government agencies, I want to go back to the book that you wrote about the KGB, Secret Empire, KGB in Russia today. And you predicted, again, you wrote this in 94, if I'm not mistaken, the rise of a Russian gangster state dominated by the old KGB. And the old KGB included somebody named Vladimir Putin, who is now running Russia and is responsible for obviously what's going on in Ukraine right now. Can you tell me more about that book and about how you knew in 1994 what was coming? And is what you are seeing today in 2024, 30 years later, what you expected?
So, Secret Empire was my doctoral dissertation, and I was started working
Okay.
on it in graduate school at about the time of the Soviet collapse. Actually, right when I was wrapping things up in Central America, and but the real fight was I was just at the periphery of fighting Soviet communism, right on our border, and that's what drew me to it was the White House person suggesting, "Hey, why don't you go to Central America because you speak Spanish?" And then the real huge controversy about Reagan's agenda in Central America to fight back the communists, and then my role in that. But the real, you had to go to the heart of the brain of the beast to take it down. So as part of for my doctoral dissertation, I was researching about the KGB and what was happening to the KGB during Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika. And then the Soviet Union started collapsing. And during this time, I was working as an activist, just with my political activity skills, with Russian internal opposition inside Russia. And I was connected up with them. We were doing it all privately funded. By this time, Bill Casey was gone, so there was no government connection at all. In fact, the government would have opposed what we were doing. And by good happenstance, I was in the Kremlin the day Russia seceded from the Soviet Union and Boris Yeltsin declared the USSR is gone.
Wow, no kidding. So you were in the Kremlin, you were working with Russian separatists or however you just described them. I'm looking right now and you've got people being captured and imprisoned by, the non-Soviet, just modern day Russia for various things. You could have never come home again. I mean, that would have been worse than anything. Well, other than being killed in the war in Nicaragua, but this is something where you could be in that prison cell right now, and this was in the heart of the Soviet time, in the Cold War.
Well, but the Soviet regime, relatively speaking, was fairly benign by that time, and there was a lot of confusion. The KGB knew the whole thing was collapsing. They were looking out for themselves. They weren't going around arresting people, so people could pretty much say what they wanted. And a lot of the KGB people and others were ingratiating themselves with every Westerner they could find because they wanted to land on their feet and become a businessman or become, somehow stay on top. So it was really
Okay.
um, it was not as hard as it might sound. It was very easy for me to meet, and I only spoke pidgin Russian. I taught myself, and so it's really lame. But the Russians are very gracious people. So if you can even just try to speak their language and butcher it, they're still really happy and they praise you for how well you speak. So I got to talk to a lot of people, journalists, human rights activists, democratic activists, and even KGB officers, and they either spoke English or with somebody who did. So I was able to communicate really freely with them and get a lot of information for my doctoral dissertation from inside the KGB and from journalists and human rights people who had ransacked KGB offices they had bags and bags and even apartments full of documents that they had taken. And they gave me a bunch of copies of them and could have had more if we just had access to more Xerox machines and paper photocopiers. So it was a time when and a lot of KGB officers came out and they just wanted to talk either because they, again, wanted to ingratiate themselves or they wanted credit for things they could never talk about, or they were just boasting. So a lot of it was probably not true. But you got to meet people. And then so in the course of putting this thing as disciplined scholarship, it's a Wild West kind of atmosphere in Moscow. And you're right in the middle of it and just bringing home bags of stuff and trying to make sense of it all. So, but in the course of that, I was looking at the Russian laws that were being passed and instead of building a political party, President Boris Yeltsin, who did the great thing of pulling Russia out of the USSR and collapsing everything, he used the old KGB as his main support base. And they had laws back then where every new joint venture with foreigners had to have a KGB man as a vice president. And this and so many other things, I think they're setting up a gangster state, and it's going to be a gangster state run by the KGB, and it's just a question of time before an actual KGB front man or an officer himself comes and runs the country. And nobody wanted to hear this at the time because everybody just wanted, sunshine and roses about everything Russian.
Right. Okay. And sure enough, you were exactly right. And we'll come to Putin in a moment here. And by the way, I'll take your word for it that it was as benign as you say. I still think you're being a little bit humble because I can't imagine the threat that you would have been under there, even if there were not necessarily KGB agents looking to arrest everybody. You're working kind of subversively with Russian separatists to kind of undermine what's going on there. So, I mean, I give you so much credit for that. But I will take your word for it that it wasn't as risky as you said, as I perhaps might imagine it to be. But you were right. Now we got a former KGB guy. Vladimir Putin is running this country. He is running it in much more of the early Soviet way than a lot of other people. He decided to cross Obama's red line in 2014 and annex Crimea, the peninsula. Now, of course, just 2 years ago, he goes into Ukraine full. Describe Vladimir Putin, and is he, or how much is he like what they were during the actual Soviet heyday?
A lot of times you could tell a KGB officer by his demeanor. So the foreign intelligence officers, not so much, because they were educated and they were sophisticated and they could blend in and they were trained to be nice to you, so they could recruit you or compromise you or set up some kind of productive covert relationship with you. Those were easy to point out abroad because not many Russians or Soviets were allowed abroad and they couldn't spend money freely. And the ones who spoke fluent English were well educated. If they're authorized to go abroad and operate like that, you knew they were at least working with the KGB, if not KGB officers themselves. But they blended in as Westerners, so you could identify them abroad, but they didn't work inside Russia. The inside guys, if they were really imbued with the KGB traditions, which they were, as they went through the different academies and schools, you could kind of tell just by looking at them and by the way they acted. And so to get back to your point, it was in St. Petersburg, Russia. This was around 1994. And I was meeting different members of the St. Petersburg City Council. And the KGB men called themselves Chekisti, or Chekists, after the Cheka, which was the Bolshevik foundation of the KGB. So they call themselves Chekists. And I'm meeting these different officials, and then there was a guy who was shorter than I am, a bit shorter, like up to here. And he looked, and he had sort of a really cheap suit, and he looked kind of sort of oily and had this sort of oily demeanor to him. And he would look like this at you, have his head down, but still try to look in your eye. And I refused to shake hands with him because he was just struck me as the sleaziest kind of Chekist. And I just said a polite hello to him, and I went on. A year or two later, when the St. Petersburg government moved to Moscow to run the Kremlin, and I was looking at the pictures of the different officials, and I said, did I meet this guy before? I said it to one of my Russian friends. He said, yeah, you met him at St. Petersburg. That was that Czech that you didn't want to talk to. And that was Vladimir Putin.
I knew it.
So,
I knew where that story was going as soon as you said it, when he looked down and gave it, because that is
yeah,
what he does. I mean, that he really gives the impression, or tries to give the impression, that he is indeed in control of every situation. You call him the slimiest or whatever you said, but the most dangerous, the most the most temperamental, and the most conniving, and you could just kind of tell certain people. And in the all I've seen of Vladimir Putin is what I've seen on television, including the Tucker interview the other night, which I'll ask you about. But that's what it looks like. And when you described him a moment ago, I knew you were going to say it's Putin.
yeah, but he didn't strike him as an impressive figure. He struck me as a sort of a sleazy, underhanded figure. I think he had a makeover at some point to when he had that phase where he wanted to be
Wasn't that
cool.
bare-chested guy riding the
Yeah,
horse we saw a few years ago,
yeah,
right? Where
yeah.
he's Mr. Because that's what I picture him as being.
Right. I didn't see him that way. I just saw him as just a sleazy guy in a really cheap Soviet suit with a really sullen expression. And he had his hand out to shake it, but I just and I shook hands with a lot of KGB guys, but I just something about him, it's like, I don't know. Yeah. So Yeah, so that was
So how surprised were you? How surprised were you then that he ended up being, the premier that rose to president? I mean, when you found out that that was the guy, and you look at where he is now, do you think back to yourself? Well, you think you just said it. He had a makeover of some kind. Something happened to him that changed him, that made him obviously the powerful figure he is right now.
yeah. Well, he was running hard currency operations for the St. Petersburg city government as a deputy mayor, which was a dirty job and a dirty business. And so then he was brought to the Kremlin to run the Presidential Property Administration, which controlled hundreds of pieces of extremely valuable property all across Russia. That's how he became wealthy, by stealing as
Okay.
he was running the presidential property. Then Yeltsin made him his chief of security, a security minister, and then head of what became the FSB.
Yeah,
So
security
that was my
minister. There you go.
dissertation. Yeah. So that was my dissertation, was tracking the security ministry and its transition from the KGB to become security ministry to become the FSB and so forth. And that was my interest in somebody like Putin. And that was the product of the dissertation. But at the time he was nobody. He was just a, one more cheap suited Soviet bureaucrat in post Soviet St. Petersburg.
So how are you analyzing him right now? He went into Ukraine. He started the war. It has not gone swimmingly for him or them. Ukraine has put up quite, from what we see over here in the Western press, quite a resistance, and they're still fighting. And we were told Kyiv was going to fall in 2 weeks. By the time that thing started, it hasn't gone that way. Where do you think his mindset is now? And do you believe that if he does make his way fully through Ukraine, that is just a stepping stone to rebuilding a Soviet bloc? Is he going to go into Poland and take on a NATO nation, or what do you think his goal is at this point?
He respects power and he respects strength. And he can be limited to work in that environment where he knows that he can go so far, and he either has enough fear or respect of somebody who's strong, but there are certain lines he won't cross. He gets more aggressive when he senses weakness. He did this when he was a street gang member as a teenager in Leningrad. He preyed on what he considered effeminate boys. The whole gang did. So he's been a bully all his life, but he would never go up against somebody who's bigger than he was unless he took martial arts, which he ended up doing to excel. So he respects strength, meaning mental strength, psychological strength. So, but he won't invade when someone strong is on the other side. So, he invaded Ukraine in 2014 when Obama was president.
Right.
He didn't invade anybody when Trump was president.
Right.
Then he invaded Ukraine again in 2022 when Biden was president, when he sensed that he was pushing and pushing and pushing with his military maneuvers the previous falls, large scale military maneuvers, and he was saying he was going to go after Ukraine, but he was gaining concession after concession from the United States and Europe that some of us, myself included, really thought he would not need to invade Ukraine, because he kept getting so many concessions from the Germans and the French and the Biden administration. So why invade it if you can just have it or have more pieces of it? So then, I mean, put yourself in his shoes. First, he can never resign as president because he's a dead man as soon as he leaves the power structure. So he's got a historical legacy to build, and he views himself as, you spent 24 years in the Kremlin. That's more than most of the czars had spent in the Kremlin. So he views himself in that contextual sense. So if he can build that up at low risk to himself because the West is weak, then our perceived weakness becomes provocative, and that's how wars get started. What he didn't calculate was Boris Johnson of Britain and the Polish government and some of the small NATO allies who had been Soviet occupied before really coming ahead and wagging the dog of the United States to get involved in Ukraine. And Putin did not anticipate that.
So, Ryan, pull up that tweet real quick, because you actually tweeted this earlier today, and I found it very interesting, and I wanted to ask you when I saw this. If Biden hadn't been so provocatively weak, which is a great adjective there, in 2021, would Putin have dared to invade Ukraine again in 2022? And that was the last time Biden met and spoke directly with Vladimir Putin. Biden said that the other night, that he had not talked to him in a long time, and it had been 2 years. And I think it's because Biden is afraid to appear exactly that, which is what he is: weak and feeble, infirm mentally, cannot remember things and so forth. And that Putin would have seen that and take just extraordinary advantage of him. But you think that last meeting that they did have is what convinced him to go ahead and go into Ukraine, thinking that the United States wouldn't do anything?
Well, that's what the screenshot is designed to answer the question. So, so Putin does not invade countries if he thinks he's going to meet resistance. He just won't. And so when the U.S. was saying, and I thought it was a really good campaign on the one hand to take intelligence to show what we knew about Putin's invasion plans of Ukraine in the hopes of deterring it. But that's all great if Putin is going to respect you for strength. But it's terrible if he thinks that you're just bluffing about your support because you have no real strategy. And indeed, to this day, Biden has never, or the Biden White House has never enunciated a strategy for Ukraine. What's the end? What's the end
No
state?
one, no one has. No one has. Neither have the Republicans. The Republicans haven't done anything either. In fact, what did Mitch McConnell
Yeah.
says? As much as it takes, as long as it takes. In other words, it's a blank check for an indefinite period of time. Literally, as long as it to do what? Nobody identifies the end of that sentence.
For another forever war. That's not a strategy.
Yeah.
That's just knee jerk throw money at it. And this is how we get into trouble. And we don't seem to have learned this since the still officially active Korean conflict of the 1950s. It's still officially a state of,
Yeah, it
of
never
the
ended.
same state that it was. Yeah. So, but strategy has to come from the president. He's the commander in chief. He's the one who designs the foreign policy and then asks Congress for the money and the authorizations to execute it. The White House has issued no strategy for this.
Do you
Zero.
believe
So,
that though? Do you
yeah.
believe that the strategy or the lack of strategy is coming from the White House, or do you believe that there is somebody else behind the throne that is moving Biden's lips for him?
Well, if you consider that no president in our history has left the White House and stayed in Washington, D.C., except one. They don't even comment on the public affairs of their successor until Obama.
Right. Until now. Yeah, that's very well said. He's right there. And a lot of people believe that that is exactly what is happening here. So going back to the weakness, though, and the strength thing, if Putin goes into Ukraine, which he did because he senses the weakness of Joe Biden. But the Americans do throw, I think, with this latest, and I don't know if it's going to be approved by the House or not, but $60 billion outlay, which is going to bring it to around $200 billion we'd have thrown at this so far. They're selling that as, hey, if we don't stop him at Ukraine, he's going to continue and go into Poland, which is a NATO country. He's going to take on all of NATO, and we're going to be actively involved. That's the salesmanship that they're using as to why we have to throw this money at it. Do you buy it? Do you believe that if he gets into Ukraine and defeats Zelensky and pretty much occupies Ukraine, that it's going to be moving on into the next nation? Do you buy that?
No.
For the same reason you
Now,
talked about
yeah,
fear of
yeah,
bigger, stronger enemies.
right. Now, if with the current cast of characters in power, why shouldn't Putin expand further? But I don't buy the argument that if we don't arm Ukraine now, we're just going to be, it'll start a war with us. If we had a strategy behind it, if we had strong, resolute leadership, because Putin knows we have no functioning commander in chief. He knows that the next successor is Kamala Harris, who, we might wish we had a senile president instead of her in the White House. So he knows all this. You don't even need to be a spy service to know these things. So that's part of the Russian calculus as well. Putin didn't. Donald Trump was so unpredictable and so resolute in supporting countries like Poland that our adversaries could not calculate how he would respond to anything that they did. So Putin just sat back and just didn't bother anybody outside his borders, with the exception of his private Wagner group mercenary armies. But then when Trump went in and had 200 of them wiped out in Syria, Putin didn't bat an eye. Didn't cause a problem. We didn't get involved in any war. Putin respected that strength that Trump was exuding and the unpredictability that
Right.
he was presenting.
That's the word.
But so, like his leadership or not, he was a leader, and you knew there'd be hell to pay if you crossed him the wrong way.
Yeah, and that word you just used too, strength is one, but the other one is unpredictability. I think the rest of the world doesn't know what this guy's going to do, and he likes it that way. And quite frankly, it's effective. One more question on foreign issues before I ask you about the domestic issues with the CIA and the FBI, which is what your book is all about. How the big intel, how the CIA and FBI went from Cold War heroes to deep state villains. But I have to ask you about China. I don't recall, hearing you talk about communism coming from China. We talked about Nicaragua, Central America. We talked about Russia, obviously. But what are you anticipating from Xi Jinping right now? He just seems to be sitting there patiently watching to see how Russia, Ukraine, United States plays out before he makes his move on whatever it's going to be with respect to Taiwan. Do you think he's actively supporting Russia or just kind of watching with an interest to see what we do because it'll help him decide what to do with the potential takeover of Taiwan? What do you think China's thinking?
Until the past year, Xi Jinping's main worry was taking and keeping absolute control of the Chinese Communist Party. That meant systematically removing his rivals and his friends of his rivals, and even his allies who he considered weak or unreliable. That's why you have the disappearances of all these Chinese billionaires. They just vanished. And some of his top people, including his top secret police people, are in prison now. So he has eliminated all of his opposition, but it's taken him until the past year to do so. So then the question becomes, okay, what is he going to do now? Now he has so committed himself personally, as the Chinese Communist Party has as a party, to take back Taiwan as what it views as a part of the People's Republic of China. So how's he going to do that? Well, he's already bought off a lot of the Taiwanese leadership. They've already persuaded, not just him, but the party before him. Taiwan has not kept up its own commitments to its own self-defense. It could never match the mainland China, of course, but it could at least make a big effort to do it, and they have not done such a thing. They don't really have a strategy of their own, even though the current Taiwanese leadership is pretty strong against the Chinese Communist Party and hasn't been bought off like the old Kuomintang party has. So it's in Xi Jinping's interest. He is very patient. The Chinese Communist Party is very patient and gradual. Chinese culture is far more patient and gradual than Western cultures, where we want to do things now. They require predictability, and especially Xi Jinping requires predictability. And to sit back and watch how your friends, enemies, frenemies, whatever you call it, how they work with one another. So if the United States can get itself bogged down senselessly in Ukraine and with Iran and the Houthis and Iranian proxies, Xi Jinping gets to see, now that he's building his own blue water navy, how are we acting with this? How are we united or divided as a country? What's our leadership like? Do we have sensible strategy to take on two-front conflicts at the same time, or can we defeat or push back
Well,
the Chinese regime apart from military means?
it
So
may
you
not
just
even matter. In those two different regions of the world, it may not even matter when we're inviting them right into our own backyard. I mean, there are Iranian-backed proxies and foreign terrorists who are flowing across that border along with a bunch of other migrants, and as you know, thousands upon thousands of Chinese, not families, just Chinese males. I mean, it's a full-on invasion of some of America's most volatile. I won't call them enemies. We're not at war with China, but adversaries anyway. But Chinese nationals, and again, so many Middle Eastern immigrants are coming into this country through that porous southern border. I'm waiting for it to explode right here. We won't even have to go very far to fight them. They're going to be here.
So then, why would Xi Jinping want a military conflict with the United States if he can help us self-destruct by bringing in what might be People's Liberation Army sapper sabotage terrorist units, or might be emptying his prisons into the United States the way Venezuela has done and other countries are doing?
Yep.
So why fight us if we can fight ourselves?
The only thing I can think of, if he were to go into Taiwan, is it's going to require some sort of support from us because it's in our strategic interest to support Taiwan. Obviously, it's nothing new, and that kind of just deflects or defers some of our resources to that conflict while the chaos is reigning within. In other words, a lot of people have said, we won't ever withdraw our troops or our resources from bases around the world, strategic locations around the world, unless we're actually attacked in the homeland. Then we're going to bring them all home to support and defend. That's the only thing I can think of. If Xi Jinping is looking and saying, "We'll wait. We'll do what we have to do inside, then we'll start something over here, and we'll actually divide their forces in at least two different places. And if we're still in dealing with Iran in the Middle East, maybe three different places, and we won't even be able to defend ourselves here on the homeland." That's just all I
Yeah.
can think of as a non-military mind. This is just a layman's perspective.
Well, it's the political mind that determines what the military does, right? It's the political elected leaders who tell the military what they need to do. So the military has different strategy options for whatever kind of conflict is there. Usually, the conflict ends up being something that nobody thought of or planned for, but it's always so it takes the political mind to do this. And Xi Jinping is a political figure. He's a ruthless. If you rise to the top of the Chinese Communist Party, think of the ruthlessness that requires and the patience it requires. So if he can get us to to fight ourselves, to destroy our own country by ourselves, and to let in all the worst elements of the world over the border, we've got at least 8 million known illegal aliens coming in just in the past few years. Every day, when you have these 10 or 12,000 people coming over per day, that's the equivalent of one U.S. Army division invading us per day.
Yeah, that's staggering. I say that all the time on my radio program. If you look at the scores of people crossing that border, put them all in the same colored shirt, and we have an invasion. It's a full-on armed invasion, or not, maybe not armed, but an army essentially. If they were all wearing the same shirt and if they were all speaking the same language, it happens to be that some of them speak Arabic, some of them speak Chinese, some of them speak, Spanish or what have you. But the reality is, it is that big. You're exactly right, and that's a good way for people to look at it. It's like a military division a day coming across that border, and the only question is what is their goal when they get here? Let's talk about inside the United States. Russia, we've been talking about, a police state. China is a police state. So many of the Muslim theocracies in the Middle East are essentially police states. Nobody has freedom. You describe in your book the growing police state of the United States. What does that mean?
And it's a term that I thought of a long time before actually using because it's a really serious thing to say. But having been in a lot of police states, including the Soviet Union and Russia, and seeing how they work and studying up close how they work, when you have a law enforcement service and a domestic security service and a domestic intelligence service with police functions that performs a political role, then you have a state that is run by a police apparatus. And no one has said this better than Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who I never agree with on really anything to speak of. But when he said to President Trump, when Trump was coming right into office, Trump saying he's going to tackle this issue, and he said, if you go after the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday to get you. So imagine that then. The Senate Majority Leader, the most powerful man in the United States Congress, says that neither he as a Democrat nor Trump as a Republican stands a chance against the CIA and FBI and the rest of the intelligence community because they will get you. What does it say about our constitutional system and what's happened to it? What does it say about a permanent police system that
It says there is no constitution anymore. If that's what they do, that's what it says. It says the constitutional system has collapsed. But I was just about to ask. I mean, having been warned of that, which President Trump was, one might think that he would put a hell of a lot of time into deciding who leads it and picking the right person. And it was important for them to get rid of James Comey. But to make the choice of Christopher Wray the way that he did, who is indeed doing exactly what Schumer warned would be done, and I'm not just saying just the FBI, but I'll focus on that for the moment. That is has indeed become weaponized. And I don't care if you're a Republican president or a Democrat president or who's in charge of the Congress. If the just what Schumer said, if the intelligence agencies are going to target you, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to stop them short of replacing them. Trump chose Wray. So, I mean, I don't know what that says, but all I do know is that Chuck Schumer was right. He's being proven right now. They have 6 ways from Sunday to get not back at Trump, but all of those who supported him, including the parents at school board meetings and the Catholics who go to Latin Mass and all the other targets that they've identified.
Right, right. So like Obama and his proteges, or people even before Obama, they had the mentality to do the long march through the institutions, to get your college degree, to get these government jobs, to work in the system, to get a law degree that's built on, in most universities, law schools, critical law theory, which is the legal predecessor of critical race theory. And they're populated throughout government and throughout the intelligence community. So it's only a matter of time since George W. Bush, with the right intentions, built a strong, powerful central apparatus, reorganized everything to make sure we'd never be attacked at home again. But people weren't thinking of the second and third order effects. What if a president who wanted to abuse these powers and politicize them, what does this do? Well, it teed everything up for somebody like Obama to put radicals in on top and to reach down to the radicals inside and elevate them up so they control the central nervous system of the FBI and the CIA and many of these other agencies. Then you impose upon that wokeness the marching orders from August 2011 for diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the whole apparatus. And if you do not go along with it, you are a potential violent extremist. Therefore, it's the duty of every counterterrorism figure to stop thinking about fighting terrorism and to go after violent extremists. And the violent extremists are the people who oppose diversity.
Yeah, and you mentioned critical law theory and critical race theory, and there's critical gender theory. I mean, all of these are Marxist in their development. The division of creating oppressors from oppressed, and so on and so forth. All they have to do is create the enemies, and then decide how we're going to get them. We declare them the enemy. Everybody is united in their belief that they're the enemy, that they're a phobe or they're an ist of some kind or another, and these people have to be put down. That is a Marxist tool. So the question is how did all of these trained Marxists get power? I know Obama got power, and are people that he appointed still in these prime positions? Is that how we got to our DEI place where we are in our critical theory of all those different types that we're dealing with right now? Did it all start in 2008?
Well, that's what I went to look at in writing Big Intel. Was looking at how it happened to our intelligence and security services today. How did Obama start it? Trump didn't understand it. His team didn't understand it. They didn't repeal a lot of Obama's executive orders, let alone try to have new ones. And then they put in the Chris Wrays of the world. And then what happened under Biden? But then I started tracing back. Well, it didn't start with Obama. Where did it start? Who were these people inside? Where did they go to school? Who educated them? What political and legal theories did they embrace? And then who originated it before them, and where and why and so forth. And you trace it back 100 years. This has been happening 100 years. It started at a 1922 meeting at the Marx Engels Institute in Moscow. And they agreed there that it would be a cultural warfare, cultural revolution that would take place, not a violent Bolshevik type revolution, but where we would, in the Western societies, we would lose faith in our countries, in our senses of loyalty to country and patriotism. We would lose faith in the just systems of law or government to the extent that they existed in Europe, but especially here in the U.S. and the other English-speaking countries. And you break down that sense of patriotism, Judeo-Christian ethics, the whole morals that go around this, the Ten Commandments, the beliefs in all these moral things that keep us from doing the stuff that we really want to do, but it would just harm us and everybody else if we really did them. And then the system of laws that were derived from that. Break this up, question everything relentlessly, not to fix things, but to wreck it. wreck the community, wreck the sense of family, wreck the nuclear family, until the point now you're wrecking nature itself by saying that men are not men and women are not women, and you can just change it by surgery and by political indoctrination.
When Marx and Engels had that conversation and kind of set this in motion in 1922, do you think they knew it was going to take 100 years? Because in a weird way, as evil and as warped as it is, you almost have to admire the fact that they knew they wouldn't be around to see the payoff of what they were starting. Do you think that
Yeah.
they knew it was going to take decades and generations to eventually see the Cultural Revolution take root?
Well, both Marx and Engels were dead at the time. This was at the Bolshevik Institute that was named after them. They even said there that at that meeting in
Oh,
1922. Well, but what you said is really important, though. But what was said in 1922 was, we understand that this is going to take decades and generations, and we won't live long enough to see it. But that's the mindset of the strategic revolutionary. Marx had written about this 80 years earlier in 1843, before he even wrote the Communist Manifesto. So before he had this workers fighting against the rich, he had cultural rebellion against basically everything that was good. So he wrote all about this. So the one who designed cultural Marxism was Karl Marx himself in 1843. So he knew, and he knew in his life that this would be a generations long, permanent people struggle. So when he was writing his theories, he was well aware of it then. The Bolsheviks were well aware of it then, and the early KGB people were well aware of it then.
it's pretty remarkable that those figures that are planning cultural revolution are willing, knowing that it's going to outlive them, that their efforts are going to have to go on long past their lives ran, whether it's Marx and Engels or even, those who believe in a global caliphate in Islam. The radical globalists who truly believe that Islam we will be a one world religion underneath that. They know this is going to take literally centuries, of several generations, at least a couple of centuries. And again, they're willing to just play their small role in the big picture, to play that long game. That's a hell of a hard thing for people who are trying to survive in one lifetime to combat, knowing that what they are putting in motion is going to outlive them, and perhaps it's going to outlive us, and we feel like it's almost incumbent upon us to stop it, or else we're not going to be able to gift to the next generation that which we were gifted here, which is freedom.
And there you have it right there. This is human nature. You don't have to be a jihadist or a communist to think in the real long term. You just said it right now. This is what are you and I doing in our lives? What are your viewers doing in their lives? Not for themselves, but for the next generation and for their grandchildren. And so we all think that way in our own different ways. It's just, are we doing it for good or are we doing it for evil? And even a lot of the evildoers are really thinking that they're do-gooders.
Last thing I want to ask you is whether or not there is something we can do. I'm looking at a quote from your book. Actually, I think it's from the jacket of your book. If Americans remember what freedom once was, we can still defang big intel and return our intelligence services to the service of the democracy. I feel like that first part of that premise is the one that's going to be the hardest. If Americans remember what freedom was like, because I feel like what our youngest generations are being taught is that America was never free, and America was never exceptional, America was never great. The heyday that you remember and that I remember isn't going to be something they remember. They're going to be taught from the beginning that America was never a great place. So therefore, how do you fight for something that you didn't really believe in the first place, that wasn't great in the first place? Isn't that what we have to overcome?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the whole essence of cultural Marxism. And cultural Marxism is the philosophy that Marx developed and that was refined by others since then, and refined since that's what that 1922 meeting was for in Moscow, was to refine cultural Marxism into a real philosophy and a worldview that would be an engine for people to, once they get it, once they understand it and subscribe to it, they can just go out and do it on their own. So they're not under the control of any intelligence agent. They just believe in it. And this was what the critical theory was, the theoretical base for promoting cultural Marxism, and which is what gives us critical legal theory. to weaponize the law. Most law schools now base themselves on critical legal theory, not on American founding principles legal theory or common law. And then critical sex theory, critical race theory, and all kinds of other critical theories that are imposed on us. But of course, they don't say Marxist, so nobody really perceives it as that. Even, a lot of folks think it's almost crazy talk to, or it might even be crazy talk to be talking about cultural Marxism, but it wasn't to Marx because he invented it. And somebody at Wikipedia just did something a few months ago, not that it's a reliable place to go because it's always being manipulated, but they had a pretty decent page called Critical Theory, and it was all about critical theory. Well, somebody went and changed it to Critical Theory Conspiracy. Oh, no,
of course they did.
Cultural Marxism Conspiracy Theory. And so now it's just this right-wing crazy thing. So it's not real anymore. So they're gaslighting us through every possible means to make us think that there's no such thing as cultural Marxism. Therefore, there's no such thing as
that's how they insist on survival. Yeah, that's how they insist and guarantee survival.
Yep. Yeah. So you got to silence and cancel people because you can't have them talking about these things.
Yeah, if they talk about, deny the existence of global warming or climate change, or deny, so many of these other things that they have us believing, well, we're the nuts, we're the conspiracy theorists. If you don't believe in the vaccine, that it's safe and effective, if you don't believe that, diversity and equity and inclusion are the most important things to success, well, then you are a conspiracy nut and you are to be dismissed, silenced, and if not silenced, then just dismissed as a kook. And it's part of, like you said, the Cultural Revolution. So the book by Dr. J. Michael Waller is Big Intel: How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains. We've shown that to you. Make sure you check out his website. It's on the screen in front of you underneath him, as well as his Twitter handle as well. Give him a follow there, as I did, and I was able to pull up that very prescient tweet about the weakness of the Biden administration, kind of compelling people like Vladimir Putin to make their next big, bold moves. Dr. Waller, it's a pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Your work is phenomenal. Keep up the great work. And we'll tell people also to make sure to check out Center for Security Policy there, because that is a very important organization. That's Center for Security Policy. And Dr. Waller is a prominent figure there as well. So, Dr. Waller, thank you. Best of luck with the book. Keep up the great work, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Thanks. Let's do it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. All right. Like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified for all our new videos. New episodes dropping every Tuesday morning, and we'll have some of our favorite interviews from the vault dropping on Fridays as well.